And I thought the way that I might start is just to say one or two probably fragmentary and disjointed things about my feelings about the self at the present time, because it is such a huge and impossible topic. And none of us, I think, can ever totally agree on what we mean when we're talking about the self. So I'll just say one or two idiosyncratic things, both about my clinical work in the consulting room and where I feel myself is at the present time. What comes very much into mind, I think, for me, is Lear's observation in King Lear. Is man no more than this? Is man no more than this? And I think that this is one of the things that frequently happen to patients in the consulting room, in their dreams, in moments of observation, often moments of terror. A patient may have a dream and look into the mirror and be terrified because there's so little there. Is this all I am? Oh God, help me. And I think that a lot of my work actually is about coming to terms with the fact that man is no more than this, and Hilary may have something, whatever the this is, and hopefully some of that may come across while we're talking. I also want to say that I think it's much easier to talk about what do we mean by the self than it is to be certain, for example, that patients actually manage to bring their selves into the consulting room, that it can be a situation where you think that you're in touch with someone's self, but in fact they've left it behind, leaving their tails behind them. They're there, but their tail, both in the terms of their narrative or their self, may not be there. And how does one ever know? How do you ever know that someone's not actually distracting you from something even worse? Or the fear, as I've just said, that there is in fact nothing there. So that's something I'm very preoccupied with. And in terms of my own self-development, I think I used to feel very strongly, along with some of the romantics and the metaphysical poets, particularly Thomas Traherne, when he said, but now I find myself the less, the more I grow, and the idea of how language alienates ourselves. We're alienated through language, and that one can never get across the solipsistic gap. But I no longer feel like that, thankfully, any longer, or this ideal of childhood and innocence being closest to the self. I feel as I've grown older that I've come to feel I've got a more substantial self, and the way in which I, thinking about this, measured it most recently was with the idea of rejection, and that for me, rejection, and I think for lots of people, that was really a great Medusa, the idea of being rejected, and that when people rejected me, it was awful. It was like a total annihilation of myself. There was nothing left. Whereas I now feel that when I'm rejected, there's still quite a substantial part of myself there. And likewise, I feel this idea of saying the wrong thing or wanting to bite one's tongue off, which again is biting one's self off, that it doesn't matter if I say the wrong thing, and I shall probably say the names of some of Hilary's characters wrongly today, because I'm very good at doing that, and I shan't mind if she corrects me. But that I can bear to say the wrong thing and not feel I've lost myself or die of shame. And as a way to sort of bringing Hilary and I closer together, I thought I might just describe some of the details of the way in which our relationship has been evolving, because it may help people again to sort of get in touch with this process. But although I don't think we will really talk a great deal about an experiment in love in the dialogue between us, but you as an audience can certainly come back to it in the questions. It was certainly an experiment in love. I hadn't heard of Hilary before that. I didn't know of any of her other books. And I happened to see, which was rather unusual, a great big piece in the Times, which actually had about a page of her prose announcing this brilliant book and this extraordinary writing. And there was actually an excerpt in the publisher's advert. So I thought, oh, goodness, what a lot of hype. And I turned to read it, wanting to demolish it. And as I read it, I could find nothing at all to demolish, but I was just absolutely awestruck. I think it was actually a description of a northern landscape, something I know relatively little about, only as a tourist. Hilary can't even remember which the excerpt was. But by the time I got to the end of it, I thought, my goodness, this is just exquisite prose. And there wasn't a lot of narrative in that passage. And I rushed out and bought the book. But I've never got a copy of the book. I've got all Hilary's other books because I never stop giving it away. As soon as I buy it, I give it to someone. So we have got a copy over there, thankfully. And I read the book and I was deeply, deeply impressed. And then in relation to another project, I decided to write to Hilary, and also with a view to inviting her here. And I wrote to Hilary, and the letter, I mean, I was amazed actually. I sent it to the London Review of Books, and I was amazed that I got any response at all. But not only did I get a response from Hilary, but I got the sort of letter from her, which I don't know how, it was just by a twist of a phrase or a certain sentence. She invited me to be personal, to somehow to reveal myself rather than just be polite or proper, to make disclosures. And so a correspondence grew up between us, and we hadn't spoken on the telephone, we only spoke on the phone a few weeks ago. But this correspondence grew, in which I was saying all sorts of things to Hilary that I might not say to anyone else, and I also felt she was saying things to me that were very special. And then the day came when we actually had to speak on the telephone. And as soon as I heard Hilary's voice, I was shocked. I thought, but this isn't the Hilary I've been writing to. This is someone. Who is this? And I then realised that without any awareness, I'd constructed an interior Hilary Mantel. And I can only say, I mean, I have no idea who I had constructed. I had certain ideas, or whether I'd constructed an extension of myself. But her voice broke in, and there was a real person out there whose voice did not fit in. She sounded much more homely and accessible than I had expected. And so we spoke to each other on the phone, and then we had to make arrangements subsequently to meet. And then right at the end of the conversation, Hilary said, but will you know who I am? And I said, well, yes, of course I'll know who you are. And she said, well, how? And I said, well, I know you're dark. And she said, no, I'm not dark. And then she said, and I've asked permission to quote this, she said, I'm fair, fat, and 45. And I said, okay, fine. And put the phone down. And when I put the phone down, I thought, well, first of all, they all start with F. So is this really a writer's sort of little clever thing? Or is she really fair, fat, and 45? And then I thought, well, how dare she be 45? Because she's written so brilliantly, and she's got such a long time, hopefully, ahead of her. And I'm already nearly 10 years older than Hilary, and I felt very aggravated that she was so young and had achieved so much. And then I felt, well, she can't be fat, because the glimpses of Hilary that I've got through her novels are of a very slender person. And well, the fair, I had to accept the fair. And so then we agreed to meet, and we met in this timeless place. And as I walked in, I was able to recognise Hilary because everyone else was over 65. So I knew that this must be Hilary. And as I walked across to meet her, I was absolutely overcome with shyness. And Hilary looked at me, and her first words to me were, and I shall pass over to Hilary at this point,
I suddenly feel terribly shy. Yes. Partly this was, I think, the apprehension that any two people like us would feel, the apprehension natural to someone. You're meeting a person in Jane's profession, and you feel she will make an interpretation of me which is not accessible to me. But of course, people feel this about writers too. They have just the same anxiety. She will see something in me that I don't know about, and she will take it and put it in a book, and I will never know about it because I didn't know it was there in the first place. There is this feeling that one may be used. But the other level of apprehension was that we had agreed to meet, so I couldn't send anybody else, could I? I had to be recognised. It was not possible for me to come and leave myself behind, as you say your patients sometimes do. So we had to do a bit of negotiation. We had to do a bit of small talk. As soon as we began to talk about the work I have done, the books I have written. That is okay for me because that's out there. This is in the realm of the Hilarys that have been sent out into the world to work, the many selves. You will not have failed to observe that when our chair kindly introduced me and, as it were, pointed to me, I immediately tried to distract you all by drinking water. It is difficult for a writer to be an object of regard. Much easier to sit, as I do now, with your characters all around you. We came to an interesting point of real contact during our conversation that day, when a mention of Ronald Lang was made. We made a connection here. I first came to Sanity, Madness and the Family when I was around about 21 years old. The books resonated with me. It was something I recognised, and I thought, I have known this all my life. I've known how people operate. But look, someone has written about it. And I think that an important point of beginning to be a writer had been reached there when I picked up that book. For Jane, there was a contrary process. It was coming across the divided self, which made her realise that she should not continue as an actress.
Absolutely, yes. For me, the divided self changed my whole career structure, and I realised that I was trying to get something out of being an actress that would never satisfy me, that I wanted positive mirroring. I wanted to be recognised, to be given attention in a way that hitherto I had not been able to receive in my life for one reason or another. But as an actress, I could do that. But when I read The Divided Self, I decided that at that time I was a student at the Royal Court Theatre, that I would stop acting, and eventually I found my way to Kingsley Hall and did some work with R.D. Lang there, but then became involved with him in the Dialectics of Liberation, which was a conference, basically, I mean, a sort of revolutionary conference, which I think ultimately he was disappointed with. But although I certainly couldn't quote anything from The Divided Self today, there are two things that Ronnie would frequently throw up as really sort of rhetorical questions, which I think are relevant in Hilary and I talking today, and which I shall sort of return to her, really, because the first thing would be almost like a sort of party trick, that he very much liked having a large gathering of people together in a room and then looking around the room and saying, well, just look around this room and think, which of these women's uterus would you like to have been conceived in? No one would answer, one would be just left with this thought. And as you'll know, that in a lot of Hilary's writing is about parenting, often bad parenting, often people wanting to ablate the parents they had. So we'll come back to that. And also, the other thing that he would frequently ask would be, do we really have a core self? When you are with someone else, what do you feel most? Do you feel you remain yourself, or do you feel that in any serious conversation with another, you change yourself and take on part of whatever that other self is that you're in communication with? And so I suppose what I want to put back to Hilary is that I wonder what the sacrifice it is that she has to make in being a writer, in speaking to us in so many different tongues. I mean, it just absolutely amazes me, the kind of the psychological space, the gender space, the geographical spaces. Her novels are all so different. There's no theme that runs through them, and she's so fluent in all of them. But what is the sort of psychological consequence of creating one character after another character that feels totally autonomous and invariably three-dimensional, And I'm reminded of Shakespeare. He wrote 2 sonnets in which he talked about the writer's persona and the consequences of writing. And in one of them he says that he's regretting that he was given this job of being a writer because he's had to sell cheap what is most dear. And so I really want to put that to Hilary, both Lang's statement and...
Yes, I think I certainly have sold cheap that which is most dear. There is a certain ruthlessness about the writing process. Unfortunately, the ruthlessness is usually directed towards oneself rather than other people. But I know that I have sat at the moment of purest heartbreak, and I have written my thoughts down. And then I have taken those thoughts and I have allocated them to one of my characters for comic effect. And what I perceive, I think I said to you, Jane, that my images are more violent than Shakespeare's metaphors of buying and selling. They are images of cannibalism and of almost self-mutilation, of pulling away parts of yourself, constantly looking for that which is extreme, looking for extreme situations. I'm not talking here about the syndrome of living so as to write your autobiography. I'm not talking about what one may do in the external world, which would amount to what people consider the proper kind of life for a writer. My own life is very contained, very orderly, and it is as dull as I can manage to make it. I'm really talking about this psychic process of going to extremes. And what I experience with regard to the self, I used to say to people when they were beginning to write, do you know, it's not enough to know what your character looks like. It's not enough to know what clothes they're wearing. You have to feel those clothes on your character's back. But that was then. And what I think now is that you have to do something even more extreme. You have to be right behind your character's eyes. Now, that is quite, if you think now in terms of masks and self, this is quite interesting. I'm not making a metaphor there. I'm not saying you have to be able to look at the world as they look at it. I'm talking about something very embodied, something very physical. To do your job properly, you be inside that character. Know their bones, know their muscles. Be able to look at someone as your character would look at them, because only certain expressions are available to their face. What I think one is striving for, I mean, you're so kind as to say one makes these characters that seem three-dimensional, that seem autonomous. And yes, I think that is what you're trying to do. You're trying to give them a total reality that is a moral reality as well. I'm very much not in the business of making puppets. I'm in the business of making beings. And I know I have to make those beings out of myself. There's nowhere else for them to come from. I don't really perceive it as a sacrifice. When you describe it, it sounds a dangerous process. From somewhere, though, I have a confidence that it is all right. I'm not going to fragment. I'm not going to shatter. There is some kind of core, though I would not like to say where it is located, and I would hate for anyone else to be able to point to it.
Well, one of the things that I was just resonating while you were speaking then was when you were talking about a dull life or this, because I think, you know, one of the things that I experience as an analyst is that well, not every day, because of course, having said is man no more than this, then to go on to talk about the highly dramatic nature of people's existence. But nevertheless, I find it, for example, very, very hard to go to a theatre after a day's work in the consulting room, because I feel I've witnessed so much drama sometimes, even if it's a mute kind of drama, or so much emotional intensity, that the last thing I want is any more kind of stimulation. But I also was thinking, Hilary, that whilst you're describing this process of being a writer, you were saying to me that you'd been through a kind of personal crisis towards the end of last year, and that it's only now that you actually, well, I think very recently, you recently wrote a story where you felt able to say to yourself, I can now call myself a writer.
Yes, this is true.
In spite of all the prizes.
Yes, and the process of becoming a writer, it isn't something that starts and then there is a day when you get a book accepted and you are then a writer. It is a continuous process of becoming, I feel, and one goes through different stages of it. Last autumn, I began to reread one of my books, which I had not read since its publication in 1992. And I began to reread it for practical reasons, because I had been asked to talk about it at a number of festivals and reading and public readings, so I thought I had better be reacquainted with it. And I had the very strange experience of becoming very frightened by my own work, almost as if I was suffering a kind of writer's version of post-traumatic stress, as if it had got separated from me and was somehow able to frighten me very much. And at the lowest point of this, which is quite unlike anything I've gone through before, I spent the most fearful night of my life. I should say that I probably have come to an important point. I'm actually fair, fat and 44, so I don't know why I said that. And I've been writing for 22 years, and for 11 of those years I've been published. So my life has chopped itself up into this neat 4 sections. So you could say, right, for those last 11 years, there has been a kind of public self, a kind of persona, which is to do with the nature of my trade. So one can say that, in a way, perhaps I was ripe for some kind of crisis, but I could not have predicted what it would have been. And my night of horror was, it seemed that devils had crawled out of my book, out of my own work. And it's not often one does really spend a sleepless night, but on this occasion I did. And the devils seemed to be sitting in the corner and looking at me. And I got myself into a state of terror. And I did not know how this would end. I thought perhaps I would die. In some way, existentially. What then happened a couple of weeks later was that I met a person, a woman of my own age, who I immediately knew to be very, very important in my life. And at first when we met, we could not work out what our respective roles were to each other at all. And then I decided it was quite simple. She was my muse. And I never quite understood why women writers were reckoned to be able to do without them. And the process has been a two-way one for us, in that she has released a sort of creative potential in me. And I have now embarked on radio drama, on a stage play, on a whole raft of things that I couldn't have contemplated 6 months ago. She, in turn, has begun to write. A few weeks ago, I wrote a story called Terminus, which begins On January the 9th, 10:15 on a dark, sleety morning, I saw my dead father on a train pulling out of Clapham Junction, bound for Waterloo. The writing of this story was the most extraordinary process for me. And when I had done it, and it was quite quickly completed, I sat and looked at it till 4 o'clock in the morning, putting a restraint on myself, saying, don't change anything. Either this is so, or it is not, but it is not anything other than what you have put on the page. And I did feel I had made a breakthrough. And I thought, wow, now you know what it is to be a writer. Yesterday you didn't know. So there has been this really extraordinary sequence of events in my life. And of course our beginning to know each other, I think, has possibly been quite important in that process. And I feel like you, the complexity of the events that have brought us to this room.
Mm-hmm. Well, having read Terminus, I want to say that I really do think that reading it takes one into a totally new dimension that you haven't been before, and perhaps no one else has either, in the way that you're going to go to it. But I think that at this point it might be quite helpful, because Hilary is talking about the possibility of transformation, of recreating herself in yet another form, to turn to one of her characters. I had great difficulty deciding which character I'd most like to have this very marvellous opportunity of exploring with Hilary here. But I found myself coming to a character who couldn't be more opposite. And of course, when I say he, at some level, he embodies something of Hilary or something of Hilary's experience. But someone who is completely stark, in fact, who sacrificed their self, literally in a sense, and I'll ask Hilary to fill you in, at about the age of 18, when he was hoping to go to university to, is it paleontology or geology?
Well, he would have studied geology. Yes, but paleontology is his chief interest, I think. Yes, Ralph Eldred.
And this is in, we haven't said where it is, a change of climate.
Change of climate.
Yes.
Yes, Ralph Eldred's background. He's born 1930, East Anglia, into an evangelical Protestant family of immense, it's a contradiction to say immense narrowness, of extreme narrowness of outlook and view, embedded in a context of other families who all reinforce each other's thinking. As some of you might be aware, my own background is of Catholicism. So writing about Ralph enabled me to try on a mask. It was a bit of spiritual ventriloquism, if you would like. I wanted to explore what might seem the opposite in terms of how one would develop and grow spiritually. Ralph goes as a boy to Yorkshire, and on the beach there he picks up a fossil, and he feels he holds a certain reality in his hand which he has not glimpsed so far. It's a crucial stage in his development. He is asking himself, what order is there in the world? But of course, because of his family are not so narrow as to think they will single-handed combat Darwinism. They think it's all very well for other people. But they do not particularly want their son to go down the path of studying evolution, of seeming by doing so to reject their values. So when Ralph wants to go to university to study geology, a crisis occurs in this family, because they have to force him out of his will and into theirs. And shall I say what they do?
Yes, because that's not reflected in this passage.
Yes. They put pressure on him. His sister Emma, his younger sister, of whom he's very protective, wishes to go to medical school. They take Ralph aside and they say, if you go off on this path of which we disapprove, our friends will say we haven't brought you up properly.
And we ourselves will have to say, well, indeed, have we brought you up properly? And we will have to look very carefully at how Emma proceeds through life. And what, in fact, they do to him is they say that if he doesn't obey them, they won't let Emma go to medical school, they will want her at home, they will want her under their eye, they just might let her be a nurse. Faced with this clash between his sister's interests and his own, Ralph, who is very much in the business of trying to be good, sacrifices himself. And at that point, though I had not realised it, I dropped myself into all sorts of difficulties as a novelist. Do you want to read the passage
We'll
first?
read the passage and then come...
Yes.
And I'll ask you to read the other passage. The passage I'm going to read precedes what Hilary's described. At this stage, Ralph still has his future ahead of him, although presumably Hilary, I'm not sure, but I would imagine she had some idea that he was going to make this act of self-sacrifice. Was the narrative that worked out?
No, I didn't know quite what they were going to say to him. I knew they were going to put pressure on him somehow.
But when he's recording being on the beach, I mean, his life is still ahead of him at that point,
Yes.
in a sense. It's full of some sort of hope.
I knew the main outline
Yes,
of what
yes.
would happen. Yes.
So this is earlier on in the novel, and the reason I chose that, although it was difficult to explain this bit to Hilary, but as the audience is primarily counsellors, but I was thinking that this description, although Ralph very much loses himself, he's an arrested personality, he doesn't develop in the novel, but this description is one which seemed to me not so much a self-object in Cahoot's terms, but certainly an image of his self as he then possessed it. And after, I'll ask Hilary to read almost at the very end of the novel, and you'll see the link. I mean, I can't explain it, but you'll see why I've chosen these two passages when we read them. But for me, this was a way in which unconsciously, if you like, we are being put in touch with Ralph's self rather than the character in a narrative sense. A year later, Ralph went to Yorkshire, and he's at this time he's about, I imagine, 15, 16. Yes. His request surprised his family and gave some pale gratification to the relatives, who had found him a quiet boy who offered no offence, and were glad that someone in the family seemed to like them. He spent his days on the beaches and in the town museum. He did not speak of his discoveries at home, but he found a schoolmaster to encourage him, a man whom, he realised later, he should have enlisted on his side when the quarrel came. He studied alone after school, sent for books with his pocket money, and puzzled over geological maps. He walked fields, hills, coastal paths, examined ditches and road cuttings. When he was tired and discouraged that there were things he could not understand, he thought of the woman on the Yorkshire beach, putting out the purple tip of her tongue to taste the fossil, its silt and grit, its coldness and its age. As a little boy, he'd met this woman on the beach. There was a trick he had to perfect, to look at a landscape and strip away the effect of man. England transforms itself under the geologist's eye. The scavenger sheep are herded away into the future, and a forest grows in a peat bog, each tree seeded by imagination. Where others saw the lie of the land, Ralph saw the path of the glacier. He saw the desert beneath copse and stream, and the glories of Europe stewing beneath a warm, clear, shallow sea. And then, Hilary, if you'll read a page.
Yes.
This is very close to the end of the book, and Hilary can just say a little bit.
If there are any paleontologists in the audience, please forgive me if I mispronounce the technicalities. Ralph has now come to the ultimate crisis of his life. It seems that his marriage has broken down and that everything has gone from him. The fossil has been to do with his sense of self, I believe, his mascot, as you might childishly call it. His hand crept into the first drawer of his desk, closed round stone, graphia. He held it to his cheek and then against his mouth. A child's life, the salt and cold. He tasted it. Phylum Mollusca, class Pelecypoda, order Pterioda. Such confidence he'd felt as a child about the order of the world. Family Gryphidae, genus Gryphia, species Arcuata. The past doesn't change, of course. It lies behind you, petrified, immutable. What changes is the way you see it. Perception is everything. It turns villains into heroes and victims into collaborators. He held the object up between his fingers, took a sighting, and spun it across the room into the waste paper basket. It is necessary for Ralph to throw the fossil away in order to live the next bit of his life. The difficulty I'd handed myself. And
could you just say what happens when he goes outside? Because of the child before you...
Ralph is a man. He and his wife have lost a child. When I say lost a child, I mean they've almost literally lost a child in Africa. Ralph, he's now reached his crisis. He's about to leave his wife. I did not know what was going to happen at this stage of the book, though I am, as you'll see, 3 pages from the end. He took his cases. He walked to the door. He opened the door, and there, crawling towards him, is another child who goes back into the body of the story. A child whom Ralph, as a sort of, in his capacity as a charity worker, has been connected with. The child, Melanie, is crawling towards him over the grass. He puts down his suitcases on the threshold, and he and his wife Anna together go out to perform the work of salvage. What I wanted to leave the reader with was a sense of possibility for Ralph. His cases are quite literally on the threshold. Will he go forward? Will he go back? But he goes forward. And I wanted to leave the hope of reconciliation open.
And the child's immensely damaged.
The child Melanie, is immensely damaged, and there is a great project of restoration to be undertaken here, if they are willing to undertake it. But as they move towards her, it seems that they are. And of course it's very much in my thoughts that in restoring Melanie they will restore themselves. So I see it as a hopeful ending.
Yes.
Shall I say about the difficulty?
Yes, well, I think you were surprised by my enthusiasm when we met about Ralph, weren't you? That I had him as such alive in my mind, and then perhaps you can explain because of the difficulty you...
Yes, I had to fight this book every inch of the way to get it onto the page. No way that was it a natural process. And I felt profoundly uneasy about the character of Ralph. I felt that of all the characters I've made, I experienced him as my failure. I was surprised by Jane's enthusiasm for the character. But then she pointed out to me that when Ralph is forced to make that choice, that sacrifice, at the age of 18 or so, then a certain part of him dies there and then. A certain course of development is cut off, so that self simply cannot develop. So I'd handed myself a novelist's nightmare, a character who, by his own nature, could not develop. I dug myself a pit and I'd fallen into it. When Jane explained to me her insight that Ralph had stopped there and then, that is the most single valuable thing anyone has ever told me about any of my books. And, purely on the technical level, it makes me think, well, in future, try to avoid a Ralph.
Well, I'm very glad you didn't.
Yes.
Because it's a wonderful study of someone caught in that act of self-sacrifice and the consequences of precisely what he can't do, or maybe he can with this episode right at the end of the book, we don't know, but what you've been describing, the way in which you can go on to explore new aspects of.
Yes, you see, for a long time, as I say, until the last minute, I did not know how this book could end. I did not know how he could develop. I felt a sense of, yes, having got there in the end, but there's terrible struggles along the way, and of course it's very interesting to think that the novelist's process in writing the book, in trying to wrest it into some shape, corresponds directly to the character's own story, that he himself is trying to wrest his life into some shape. And of course, in the end, he has to reject one and go out and embrace another possibility.
Yes, but the very nature of what he embraces is hopeful.
Yes. I mean, again, I suppose it is a technical point. My reader is certainly sucked full of horror by this stage. It would be, in a way, morally irresponsible of me to walk out on my reader and leave them alone in the bleakness of the universe that I've created for Ralph. I think so much readers will put up with, and there's a point where they won't. I do feel, as I think I said to you earlier, very much responsible for the moral authenticity of my characters, for making them work all through, and having once begun Ralph, I could not but stick by him until together, staggering on together, we had got somewhere.
But you vow you'll never write another novel.
Why, I will never again trap myself within the constraints of naturalism. From now on, if I shall write fiction in which, if I want a character to spontaneously combust, they may do so. And yet, even that is not so, because the novel I'm working on now, The Giant O'Brien, is not naturalistic. The one that comes after it will be, in content if not in tone. But I did experience the whole form of it, which is very much the form of the Victorian novel, as too constraining for myself. It is not what Hilary ought to be doing.
Well, I'm wondering, Margaret, we found we might talk about Father Angren, but I don't think we've got time, and I don't know whether perhaps I should just end with Hilary's observation about childhood memories and throw it out so that it might come back in the discussion, but I don't think we've really got any more time to hold a dialogue, but I think I'll just end. This is a quote from Hilary reviewing Flicker book by Leinberg in the London Review of Books, and it might be helpful to have this in the discussion, or it might not, but that's how I think I'll end with these words of Hilary. Writers often seem to have observations about childhood that are more acute than other people's, but not necessarily more accurate. In fact, the more accurate they are, the less useful they become. So, thank you very much.